After smashing sugar for the past 6 months, Mark Bell has finally revealed his blood work on Mike Mutzel's High Intensity Health YouTube channel. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Mark's blood work together and see if his high sugar diet has made him insulin resistant over these past 6 months.
Let's go down to your insulin. This is the most surprising to me. So you've been consuming a lot of high glycemic index, refined, if you will, carbohydrates.
I mean, literally, I'm pouring sugar into smoothies, like actual sugar, taking a box of sugar and dumping sugar into smoothies.
As we go through Mark's blood work, I'll give my 2 cents on what I think his results mean, share the optimal values that I typically look for myself and for my clients, and provide you with the strategies that I personally use to turn my clients' blood work around. Now, overall, I think Mark's situation is actually quite relatable for many of us. After being a staunch low-carb and keto advocate, he decided to run an N=1 experiment and add not just carbs to his diet, but tons of refined sugar to his diet, while dropping both his fat and his protein intake, and openly documenting his experience online to his hundreds of thousands of followers. Now, while I don't think pounding tons of refined sugar is ideal for long-term health, I did go through a similar journey myself around 2015 when I moved away from low-carb dieting to a higher carb, higher sugar setup. This is also the same journey that I see many of my clients go through before we start working together as they try to transition away from low-carb dieting to higher carb eating. So despite some of the more nuanced concerns that I've voiced in previous videos about the sugar diet, overall, I think Mark's documented experience and content has been quite helpful to break the carb fear that I think people have been living with in the nutrition world over these past few years. So with all of this said, let's jump in and take a look at Mark's blood work and see if he became insulin resistant over these past 6 months on his high sugar diet. Before we jump in, if you would like to start incorporating ample amounts of healthy sugar sources and carbohydrates into your diet while keeping your blood work pristine, but you aren't quite sure where to start or you need help troubleshooting, I created a free guide for you to use to set up a pro-metabolic energy-based diet. The link's in the description. All right, so in this first clip, we're gonna hear Mark and Mike talk about Mark's fasting blood glucose. So let's jump in.
Metabolic health. And so we're going to look at the glucose, insulin, and hemoglobin A1C. Glucose here, 87 milligrams per deciliter. Totally normal. I would not suspect even mainlining sugar.
All right. So while Mike is surprised here about Mark's normal blood glucose level, or actually ideal fasting blood glucose level, less than 90 milligrams per deciliter, the target that I typically shoot for, I'm actually not surprised by Mark's result. I typically see people who are coming from a low carbohydrate diet, have lots of muscle tissue, are working out, etc., add carbohydrates in, and their insulin sensitivity improves. So that even though they're eating more carbohydrates, their body is responsive to the insulin, and you basically don't see high fasting blood glucose levels or high fasting insulin level, which we'll see Mark's fasting insulin level in just a bit. Now, if your fasting blood glucose is running a bit higher than ideal, and you're coming from a low carbohydrate diet, the first areas that I tend to look to assess are liver function, overall body composition, the hormonal profile. I look to address the dietary setup, and I start to look at micronutrient status. These are some of the major areas where problems can develop with low carb dieting and just over the long term in general that can impair blood glucose regulation and also insulin sensitivity. Now in this next clip, we're actually going to get to look at Mark's fasting insulin value, which would go hand in hand with the fasting blood glucose. So let's see what Mark and Mike have to say about Mark's fasting insulin.
Let's go down to your insulin. This is the most surprising to me. So you've been consuming a lot of high glycemic index, refined, if you will, carbohydrates.
I mean, literally, I'm pouring sugar into smoothies, like actual sugar, taking a box of sugar and dumping sugar into smoothies.
So Mark's fasting insulin is 3.9 units per ml, which I would have suspected it'd be 12, 14.
All right. So again, for me, not necessarily a surprising result. In my experience, higher carb eating doesn't automatically mean that fasting insulin elevates out of the ideal range. If you are insulin sensitive, then you don't really need that much insulin to increase glucose uptake. So while low carb dieting can lower fasting insulin, it does so not by necessarily improving insulin sensitivity, but it does so by decreasing the amount of glucose that the body is presented with. So I typically like to see fasting insulin at least less than 10 micro international units per milliliter, but ideally we want to see it less than 5. So here, Mark's fasting insulin is ideal. And again, if fasting insulin is bumped up, especially if you're coming from lower carbohydrate dieting and you're bringing carbohydrates on board, There can be a period of time where it bumps up as your body transitions to using carbs as the primary fuel source. And then B, if you have any type of other problems going on at the liver, micronutrient deficiencies, hormonal problems, or body composition issues, then I would look to address those, and you can start to see the fasting insulin come down. And again, I've worked with quite a few people where they either see an initial bump up and it comes back down to baseline, or they had some things develop on their low carb dieting or their fasting regimens, or whatever the deal is, that led to issues with their insulin sensitivity that we then corrected. And once we corrected those, they were able to eat carbohydrates and have a low fasting insulin value, or an ideal fasting insulin value, while keeping carbohydrates in the diet. All right, so in this next clip, we're going to transition to looking at Mark's liver function tests. So we're going to see GGT, and we'll also talk about ALT and AST as well.
So as you all know, we have 3 liver function tests that we look at in Bloodwork. We have the AST, ALT, and GGT. And so right here, if there was hepatic fat buildup, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis or NASH, we would expect your GGT to start to increase. And at 36 international units per liter, the ideal range, Mark, just so you know, if it was 25, it'd be perfect. You're a little bit higher than what would be considered optimal, but considering the fact that you've been having a lot of sugar, I'm relatively impressed, to be frank with you.
All right, so in this specific clip, Mike and Mark are talking just about GGT, and it's a good thing that Mark got GGT done because his ALT and his AST are bumped. And these are liver function values, yes, but they can also be bumped for a variety of other reasons that aren't directly related to having a liver problem. And so in this circumstance, given Mark's background, since he exercises quite a bit, it's likely that his liver function tests here are elevated specifically because of his exercise and his training regimen, not necessarily because he has a problem going on. We'll talk about that in the next clip. And where in this case, what we're seeing is that GGT is actually in normal range, which would further make me think that the ALT and AST are bumped because of Mark's training and that his liver function is actually okay overall. Now, I typically like to see GGT less than 16 units per liter. However, if he's still in normal range, but I would say this bumped up value here is potentially related to Mark's diet. He has a very, very low fat diet. There may be kind of a buildup of bile acids into the gallbladder, and there may be some pressure with a very high amount of refined sugar sources. And depending on the micronutrient density, that may play a piece as well. Plus, some of the anabolic agents he's using may create oxidative stress at the liver, which could increase the GGT in the reference range. So I would look to actually get this GGT value down a little bit more to get into a more ideal range. And solutions I would look to do this would be to not really rely on granulated sugar, honey, maple syrup, stuff like this as the primary carbohydrate source. I would actually look to increase the protein intake. I would shoot for at least 0.64 grams per pound per day in Mark's circumstance, especially if he's still trying to run a sugar diet setup. And he can still load the protein in the back end of the day and kind of follow the intermittent sugar fast setup that I made a video about, which you can check out on the channel. I would also look to bring a bit more fats on board. I typically wouldn't like to go less than 20% of calories per day from fats so that you have enough fat to stimulate bile flow, to maintain hormonal function, to stabilize blood sugar, etc. And I would use mostly monounsaturated fats in this case because the combination of high saturated fat plus high granulated sugar with protein deficiency and also potentially a lack of micronutrients could put a metabolic pressure and stress in the liver that could worsen GGT. So in this circumstance, I'd look more for monos, which are a little bit easier for the liver to metabolize than saturated fats. I'd also look for Mark to incorporate a B complex and potentially choline to help him deal with the fatty acid metabolism at the liver and also provide enough cofactors for metabolic function in general. And then if Mark is using exogenous androgens, then considering something like Silymarin and or TUDCA together, as long as he's not drinking any alcohol, could be helpful to further optimize his ALT, AST, and also GGT values, as well as potentially incorporating glycine, taurine, and NAC to optimize his glutathione function, as well as optimize his bile flow. So there's a variety of different components he can do here to get the GGT back in optimal range. And we'll get into this in a second, but I think the ALT and AST are likely just bumped because of his exercise and his training volume, not necessarily because there's a liver-specific problem. All right, so in this next clip, we're actually going to get into the ALT and AST specifically and hear what Mike has to say, and we'll run from there.
So because we addressed GGT, we should probably also address AST and ALT. These are the other two aforementioned liver enzymes. Now, the thing about AST that folks should understand, you as well, Mark, AST is not specific to the liver. It's categorized as a liver function test, but AST is also released from the heart if there's cardiovascular stress. So in your case, it is a little bit on the higher side at 63 international units per liter. So that's something that might warrant potentially a coronary artery calcium score, CTA, if you will, to just maybe look at and see where that is coming from. And the ALT is elevated as well. So it's about double of what we would want. This isn't alarming, but it's something to consider. So you may want to get a ultrasound of your liver just for good measure, just to see if anything changes. I wouldn't suspect that this is related to the sugar diet, because this
is very common with my blood work that these are elevated.
Okay, so a couple things. As I mentioned just before, I think the ALT and AST here are likely related to Mark's training. And the fact that Mark mentions that his AST and ALT are consistently elevated and he's been training this entire time, I think it's most likely that this is a function of his training volume and not necessarily of a cardiac problem. There's much better markers to look at for a cardiac concern than AST by itself. So I think I would disagree here that a CAC is indicated just purely based on this AST value. I would look at other markers before we went in that direction. Now, it may be indicated for Mark to follow up on his coronary artery calcium, his CAC score, given that he mentions in his videos that he has non-zero CAC scores in the past, and he continually has continual exogenous androgen use, which I don't know exactly what he's using. But again, I don't think AST necessarily justifies that here. Also, the other thing is the fatty liver concern here and the need for liver ultrasound, I think is potentially, it wouldn't be my first choice. When we look at Mark's body composition, his GGT value, his alkaline phosphatase, his albumin, his lipid panel, his insulin sensitivity, the exercise regimen, and his previous high protein intakes, I think a fatty liver concern here is not my first consideration. The first thing I would look to do is actually just have Mark take a couple days off training and then retest a comprehensive metabolic panel so that he can see if ALT and AST are still bumped. If they're not bumped, it's likely just because of his training volume and not necessarily because of fatty liver or because of a cardiovascular concern. There's other markers, and we'll talk about them here, that Mark could look at to see where his cardiovascular concern currently is, and also he could follow up on CACs, but not necessarily because of this AST value, at least in my perspective. All right, so in this next clip, we're going to hear Mark talk a little bit about his CAC score, and then we're going to jump to another clip where we hear Mark talk about the plaque concerns that he has. So let's jump into these two clips.
And we'll talk about it maybe in some other video down the road. I have not released this information, but I have had a coronary calcium score. Is that what they're called?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've had 2 of them over the years, and they're not awesome.
Okay.
The results aren't awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this could be a little bit of cardiac stress, more specifically, not hepatic stress.
All right. So that was the first clip where Mark tells us about the CAC scores. And then now we're going to jump and see the plaque concerns.
I do have calcification here with the carotid artery. Mm-hmm. And then I think they also check the groin. At least maybe they were checking my groin for no reason. I never even thought about that. But, so anyway, they check that stuff out. And yes, I do have some calcification. I don't know if it's directly from steroid usage, but it could be, because I never had a scan done beforehand when I was 20 years old or 25 years old or anything like that. So I don't really know. But so some people might think, well, Mark's an idiot. Why is he moving forward but still utilizing performance-enhancing drugs? I agree that they don't help, but at least in accordance to the information I have right now, it doesn't seem like there's much of a protocol. And I understand that steroids don't help the situation, but there's not much of a protocol to get rid of plaque.
Right.
There's really doesn't seem to be a medicine or medication. I know there's stuff for your lipids, and there's statins, and people have conjecture about keeping your certain levels really low, but my ApoB, as you look at this test, is very low. It's 65. So anyway, all that just to try to make people aware a little bit more of my medical history. I've not really talked about that openly, and the reason why I haven't talked.
Okay, so it is cool that Mark actually shares his some of these results here, because I feel like a lot of health influencers probably wouldn't share that they don't have 0 CAC scores or something like this. I do think when you look at Mark's previous history and you look at the powerlifting stuff, and he talks about using performance enhancing drugs in the past, it's likely that some of those, plus depending on the dietary setup and metabolic health he had in the past, he mentioned in this video his CRP at one point was 12. That could have led to circumstance where he had developed plaque formation. He could have stabilized it in the meantime. It could be regressing. It could be progressing. Kind of difficult to tell because we don't have those results. But I think it's the previous metabolic state and then the performance enhancing drug use could probably have contributed significantly to the initial formation of plaque in the arteries. The performance enhancing drugs, depending on which ones you're using, can ratchet up the RAS system and also shift the lipid profile in a negative way while driving oxidative stress. And the combination of these factors can actually lead to damage to the vasculature over time, which is why bodybuilders tend to use, or at least some bodybuilders tend to use a variety of different medications to offset the effects of the drugs they're using. So things to protect the liver, TUDCA is one of them. Then you have, they're using different types of lipid lowering medications or medications to shift the lipid profile, as well as medications that help to lower RAS activity, things like angiotensin receptor blockers, and then potentially components to protect the heart from the increased sympathetic nervous system activity that you see with steroids. So these are things like beta blockers. So depending on which way you're going and what you're looking to do with bodybuilding, some of those things would be helpful to offset some of the side effects. And it doesn't sound like Mark did some of those things during his time frame. But either way, in this circumstance with established plaque formation, some of the things that I would be looking to do would look at the major areas or components that are actually out of whack with the different blood values, because you can trend the blood values a little bit more consistently with less radiation exposure than a coronary artery calcium score. So you could look at blood pressure and RAS system activity. You could look at insulin sensitivity, so things like the hemoglobin A1C, insulin glucose, a HOMA-IR, an LP-IR score, and then also use a CGM. You could look at lipoprotein amounts and distribution. So they didn't do it. They did ApoB and ApoA1 here, but an NMR lipid panel would have been more helpful. Mark could look at his parathyroid hormone values as well as his total calcium status to see what's going on or try to get a gauge with vascular calcification. So that's parathyroid hormone, vitamin D3, RBC magnesium, calcium, and phosphorus. He could look at his endothelial nitric oxide signaling. This would be a value like an ADMA, which is an asymmetric dimethyl arginine. And then you can look at thyroid function values, which we have some here. We'll see some of them aren't ideal. We can look at stress and adrenal function. So this is DHEA-S, cortisol, pregnenolone. We can look at oxidative stress markers to see which things are beating up on the vasculature. The homocysteine, a total glutathione, and ox-LDL GGT, which we do have a GGT and a homocysteine. We'll talk about the homocysteine soon. And then we have micronutrient status, iron overload concerns or iron deficiency, zinc, copper, manganese, and selenium. These are involved in the antioxidant enzymes that help to minimize some of the oxidative stress and optimize the handling of lipids in the body. Then we also have inflammatory signaling markers like hsCRP, glyc-A, ESR, fibrinogen activity, and lipoprotein-associated phospholipase A2. So these will help us get a sense of the inflammatory burden in general, but also in the cardiovascular system, and an immune activation with markers like myeloperoxidase and a neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. So what we would do is look at these markers on a consistent basis and get them into the optimal range through diet, through supplementation, appropriate medication utilization, these types of components, to start to not just target just lipids, but also target vascular function, minimize oxidative stress, get the hormones under control so that you don't have some of these stress hormones like parathyroid hormone, like angiotensin 2 in the RAS system, like adrenaline in the sympathetic nervous system that beat up on the vascular system over time, and make sure those are optimized. Run that for a period of time and then follow up on the CAC score. So I don't think that there's going to be a singular drug therapy personally. I think there's going to be a combination therapy that includes multiple different components to get the plaque situation under control. That would be the way that I would look to address this. So these are some of the things to look at, and then there's strategies to get each of these components under control. So that's something that I look to do when somebody's saying, hey, my CAC is X. I have a client right now with CAC, I think he's in the 700s, and there's like multiple things to look. He's working with a cardiologist. We're working together with nutrition to get these things under control. And these are some of the values that we're actually working with to dial in. So on this next clip that we're going to look at here, Mike actually talks about one of the factors that he thinks is a prime driver for or an important driver in Mark's cardiovascular disease. And we'll see if I agree with this one.
When we look to your CBC, so I know we're kind of moving gears a little bit. I don't want to bounce around too much, but it's pertinent to what we're talking about here. Reducing the factors that may exacerbate or worsen coronary artery atherosclerosis and carotid artery atherosclerosis is reducing the shear stress in the body. So we flip to the CBC with differential here. And so what we see, these are your white blood cells and red blood cells, and we want to look for the indicators of increased blood thickness or viscosity. And that is part of the atherogenic potential problem with any anabolics, whether it's HRT or exogenous steroid use or whatever, is one of the benefits, and this is how anabolics were discovered in AIDS patients, is they would increase and ameliorate anemias in people with AIDS, right? Or other wasting conditions. And so by increasing erythropoietin, which is helpful in athletic contexts to a certain point. So what happens here, Mark, as we look at your labs, your hematocrit is 49%. So if you were racing in the Tour de France, you're 0.9% away from being disqualified. Because
okay. So Mike eventually recommends a blood donation here for Mark. Now, while I do think a blood donation would be something for Mark to consider, it's not necessarily because of his normal hematocrit value. So while androgens can actually increase hematocrit values, this is true, and they can actually get them quite high sometimes, which there's some question around whether that's a concern. Some of the TRT community doesn't think that it's actually a concern. I think that getting hematocrit too high can actually be a concern. And getting the TRT dose or the androgen dose appropriate can be really important for making sure the hematocrit doesn't keep bumping up. So you have to keep donating blood. But in this circumstance, I don't think Mark is falling into this camp. I mean, it's a completely normal hematocrit. His RBCs and his hemoglobin levels are also completely normal. I don't think he's like in this like problematic territory range where his hematocrit is so high that it's making his blood so thick that it's putting that much shear stress pressure on the arteries or putting that much pressure on the heart. So a blood donation could be helpful. We'll see later on for a ferritin value being very like on the higher end, but not necessarily because of the hematocrit. I think in this circumstance, his hematocrit value is actually fine here. And I don't think that he's driving excessive increases in the thickness of his blood viscosity. And the research actually, there's multiple theories in the research. One of them is optimal hematocrit theory, which basically talks about hematocrit being between about 30 to 50%. Being ideal so that you have blood that's not so thick that you can't transport it through the vasculature, but it also has a high enough hematocrit so that you can carry oxygen effectively. So Mark is still within that range. He's still at this, at an optimal value here. So I think this is less of a concern from my end overall. All right. So in this next clip, we actually get to take a look, and it's a little bit out of order. I'm going in order of the video, but we get to take a look at Mark's triglycerides. Ideally, we would have looked at the lipid panel and triglycerides after fasting blood glucose and fasting insulin, and then get onto the liver function test, but it is what it is. So let's jump in.
So let's skip over to lipids. Okay, we want to look at triglycerides. Whether or not someone is eating a lot of sugar or not, we want to look at, that's a good marker of metabolic health. 63 milligrams per deciliter. I would have marked, I thought they'd be over 100. So I'm impressed, man.
All right. So Mark's triglycerides here are actually ideal. I personally like to see triglycerides less than 100 milligrams per deciliter at least. So Mark at 63 is great. Now, I know this may seem surprising because you hear, carbs are going to increase triglycerides, but this goes hand in hand with fasting blood glucose and fasting insulin. If carb intake is high, even if it's in the form of sugar, if the cells are processing the fuel source effectively, whether carbs, whether fats, then there shouldn't be a backup of fuel into the blood. So while triglycerides can initially increase when you're transitioning from a low carbohydrate intake towards a higher carbohydrate intake, in metabolically healthy context, that smooths out and then things normalize and everything's okay. Now, if triglycerides are staying elevated, basically what's happening is you're seeing fuel backing up into the bloodstream. It's not necessarily because you're getting an increased production of triglycerides from fructose going to the liver, but there's a shift in fuel utilization, which leads to more triglycerides backing up into the bloodstream. Now, if that's staying elevated longer term, then we're looking to address the same concerns that I mentioned for fasting insulin, fasting blood glucose. We're looking at dietary structure. We're looking at body composition. We're looking at liver function. We're looking at hormonal profiles. All of these things and also micronutrient status are important to hone in on in these circumstances to get triglycerides, fasting insulin, fasting glucose under control. So that would, if you're dealing with those problems, we would try to figure out where the specific concerns are and then address those directly. So with my clients, I usually have people less than 100 milligrams per deciliter on their triglyceride value, despite eating hundreds of grams of carbs per day. Now, it's not granulated sugar, maple syrup, honey. So don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating for that, but they are having carbohydrates in higher amounts in their diet. It doesn't have to be super high carb, low fat like a sugar diet. There's a mixed breakdown of what an individual person will tolerate, but you should be able to have low triglycerides despite having carbohydrates. It's actually an indication of metabolic dysfunction if triglycerides are on the higher end overall. The other thing I want to point out here is if you are getting your blood tests done, it's really important that you actually get your 12-hour fasting window before you draw your labs so that you don't have a meal in the middle of the night and then triglycerides are bumped or something like this. So you want to make sure you get that window. I've had a couple of clients I worked with where they're like, oh yeah, I had this little snack. And then it's like, you don't want to eat before you get your labs drawn. So just keep that one in mind. And then from here, what we'll do is we're going to now jump into Mark's lipid panel. So luckily that's in order. So let's get to the next clip.
That's being reflective in your blood work. Your triglycerides are only 63 milligrams per deciliter. Your VLDL, which is related to insulin resistance, is quite low at just 14 milligrams per deciliter. So that's impressive. The one thing that I would like to see you increase is your HDL and your ApoA1. So as many people know,
and even my just overall cholesterol, right? It was like,
they're pretty low.
Like my overall cholesterol is like 110.
Yeah.
Or something, right?
It's 110. Exactly.
Yeah. So I was going to try to fix some of that with like eating some like shrimp and stuff like that because it has some cholesterol in there. And I will, up my fats a little bit to try to help with the markers of health here.
Yeah.
Okay. So while Mark's total cholesterol, LDL, triglycerides, and VLDL are considered to be in optimal ranges, his HDL is indeed on the lower side. Also for me, and Mark points this out as well, I think his total cholesterol is also quite a bit on the lower side. I think these functions, as they mention, are related to Mark's fat intake being excessively low. And then on top of that, Mark is using exogenous androgens, and those can directly lower HDL as well. So his HDL could be suppressed by the very high carbohydrate intake with very low fat intake on top of using exogenous androgens. And so adding in a bit of fats, particularly in this case, because of his current dietary setup, I'd say monounsaturated fats can actually help to increase his total cholesterol values, but also improve his HDL values significantly. I personally don't like to see people go less than 20% of calories for their fat intake. This not only skews the lipid panel like this, and I've seen this multiple times, but it can also impair fat-soluble nutrient absorption, can impair satiety, lead to blood glucose regulation issues, digestive problems, hormonal issues, etc. And again, if you're looking to run a sugar diet to optimize FGF21 signaling, restricting of fat is not necessarily required for that. It's more amino acids. Again, I'm not saying that this is optimal, but you don't necessarily have to restrict fat on that diet for the effect to occur. I know Mark has actually shifted his perspective. Cole has as well, whether they're doing really low fat and higher protein, higher carb now. So that I know that's continuing to evolve, but in that circumstance, if you're looking to optimize that signaling, which some people are, it's not based on fat restriction. For the lipid panel in general, the targets, and this is a basic lipid panel, the targets that I tend to shoot for HDL-C or HDL cholesterol, I like to see greater than 60 milligrams per deciliter. For VLDL cholesterol, I like to see less than 24 milligrams per deciliter. Mark's value is lower here. VLDL is actually a better indicator of cardiometabolic risk than LDL. So it's a better marker to look at. You can, if they don't give it to you on your lipid panel, you can subtract your LDL and your HDL from your total cholesterol to get that value. For LDL cholesterol, I don't weigh it so heavily. I don't think it's the best marker to look at, but the ideal target to consider would be less than 100 milligrams per deciliter, at least by current standards. And then for total cholesterol, again, I also don't weigh this one too heavily, but ideal targets by current standards are around less than 200 milligrams per deciliter. Again, with both of those values, I'm not so concerned about those components, especially when we start talking about some other more important values. We'll actually discuss those now. So the other thing is with a basic lipid panel, I'm more actually interested to see the ratios of some of these components. And the reason why is these ratios are better indicators of cardiometabolic risk than the standalone values themselves. So they help us to understand how the different lipids or how lipids in general are being processed by the body. And so the ratios that we're looking at are total cholesterol to HDL-C. Now, I like to see this at a 3-to-1 or less ratio. So normal range is 5-to-1. I like to see 3-to-1 or less. For LDL cholesterol to HDL cholesterol ratio, I like to see a 2.3-to-1 ratio or less. Typical or normal ranges are about 3-to-1 or less. And in triglycerides to HDL cholesterol ratio, I like to see 1.9-to-1 or less ratio. Basically, these are telling me how your body is processing those fatty acids. And I personally don't like to use the basic lipid panel quite as much. Overall, I would have liked to see an NMR lipid panel for Mark, because then we could have seen the small, dense LDL particles and also his total LDL particle count, as well as LDL particle size, and then the HDL particle count. So we could get a better sense of how the different lipids are being metabolized on this diet. With very high refined sugar intake, things, granulated sugar, honey, maple syrup, components like this can actually increase the small, dense LDL particles. And the reason why these are problematic is because they are more prone towards oxidation, and oxidized lipoproteins or lipids are the prime drivers for atherosclerosis, not necessarily native or normal lipids. So we want to see where the small, dense LDL particles are with these very high refined sugar sources. You can have what's called discordance, where basically the regular lipid panel and then some of the NMR values in ApoB, ApoA1 don't match up. And that's actually a predictor for cardiometabolic risk. So we would actually I prefer to see an NMR. I think it gives us a little bit more. But if you're going to get a basic lipid panel, which is much cheaper and easier to trend, then please consider looking at the ratios. When I'm looking at a panel, I'm seeing where's the triglycerides, where's the VLDL, where's the HDL, and then I'm looking at all the other ratios. I don't really look that much at total cholesterol or LDL cholesterol. Those other things, I would say, sit higher on the priority list for me than those components, and an NMR would be even more ideal. Now, with the lipid panel underway, we'll next talk about inflammation, specifically cardiac CRP, which will be important here, especially given Mark's history. So let's jump to that clip.
You mentioned inflammation, so let's look at your CRP. So your C-Reactive Protein, it's, as many of you know, this is a generalized marker of inflammation. It's not specific to any one region of the body, but it's 1.3 milligrams per liter. Ideally, this would be like 0.2, 0.5. So it's slightly elevated. I've seen it way higher.
I've had it at like 12.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this really can go really high.
Yeah. They're like, what the hell did you do? I was like, I don't know.
Okay, so while a 1.37 milligram per liter cardiac CRP isn't terrible, I really would want to see this less than 1, especially since Mark has non-zero CAC scores. So ideally, I would look to bring strategies on board to get the CRP value less than 1 ASAP. Now, the first thing is to try to understand, why is this bumped? That's the most important piece. There are some supplementary components that may help to lower CRP, not massive amounts, but if it's 12, there's like really specific things that have to be done. But if you're wanting to get from like 1.37 to less than 1, you can look at components like vitamin C, magnesium, aspirin, pycnogenol, curcumin, etc. These components can help to bring that lower, and they also have direct protective effects to the vasculature and to multiple different systems involved with cardiovascular risk. So these are some of the components that I personally like to use on a consistent basis, and I have seen them actually bring CRP levels down. So Mark can consider looking at this. The other thing I want to mention here, when somebody is looking to test this, make sure you're looking at an HS-CRP or a cardiac CRP. There's a regular CRP value. It doesn't give you quite as much information, especially when you're trying to really optimize things. If you have already like lower CRP value, you won't necessarily be able to see that with a regular CRP. So get the high sensitivity or the cardiac when you're doing your testing. All right, so in the next test here, we're going to look at Mark's homocysteine value, which is also important in his overarching cardiovascular risk.
Your homocysteine is a little bit elevated, not alarming. We talked about TMG, and even creatine is involved in methylation.
Okay, so when you have known plaque development, I would say that a homocysteine value of 14 is not ideal. So I would want to see the homocysteine between 5 and 7 micromoles per liter. So I would definitely try to get this down. The reason why is homocysteine can drive endothelial and vascular damage via oxidative stress and via impairment of endothelial-derived nitric oxide synthase. So this can impair vasodilation to arteries. So we really want to get that homocysteine into optimal range. And the things I would actually look to use here would be B-complex vitamins like 5-MTHF, methylcobalamin, as well as adequate choline. So we're looking at like a phosphatidylcholine, especially given Mark's liver. Phosphatidylcholine would be something to consider. And then also betaine could be quite helpful to lower the homocysteine value directly and get it into that optimal range. This would ultimately, I think, long-term, in conjunction with getting the CRP down, shifting the lipid panel a little bit more, and then making sure that we get the liver function values under control, would help to protect the vasculature, improve endothelial function, and optimize vasodilation. So this is something that I would actually look to address. It's not an emergency, but if you have a non-zero CAC score and you have a bumped homocysteine and a non-ideal CRP, these are things that I would directly look to address. Now, the next one we're going to get into here is going to be calcium metabolism with looking at vitamin D3. We'll talk about some of the other values that I would recommend looking at here, but let's see Mark's vitamin D3 first.
Your vitamin D is nice at 49 nanograms per ml. That's perfect. Right around 50 to 60 is ideal. Mm-hmm. So, and you don't take vitamin D, but you're in the sun a lot.
Okay. So I agree here with Mike that 49 nanograms per milliliter for the vitamin D3 is pretty close to optimal. I personally would shoot for a 50 to 75 nanograms per milliliter. The other thing I would recommend here is when looking at vitamin D3, I would actually look to test parathyroid hormone, also RBC, magnesium, calcium, and phosphorus. This would allow us to get a full picture of calcium metabolism. And this is important if you have cardiovascular risk, because PTH can be directly involved in the vascular calcification process, as well as in hypertension, as well as in metabolic dysfunction. So you want to have an optimal magnesium status, calcium status, and vitamin D3 status, so that we can actually keep PTH less than 30 picograms per milliliter is what I typically shoot for. And with our RBC magnesium, we want optimal magnesium it helps in a variety of different enzymatic processes, also is protective in a variety of different circumstances with cardiovascular disease. So we want that RBC magnesium, which is going to be our best way to actually check magnesium, because magnesium is an intercellular or an intracellular mineral. We want to see that greater than 6 milligrams per deciliter. And this will help us to understand overall vascular calcification risk. And also, if you're dealing with hypertension, getting these things under control can be quite helpful in order to actually lower PTH and help protect, at least theoretically, against vascular calcification. I'm looking to optimize somebody's calcium status, their magnesium status. So bringing calcium at least over 1 gram per day, magnesium at least 500 milligrams per day. This could be from food, that's completely fine, but food and supplements is also fine. The vitamin D3 between that 50 to 75. And then depending, if somebody has vascular calcification, I personally like to use a higher dose vitamin K2, MK4, and MK7 mix to help to activate matrix GLA protein and see if we can minimize that vascular calcification risk while also suppressing the parathyroid hormone. So these are some strategies that we can use to actually bring these down. This is also helpful to understand in context where somebody's concerned about their overall bone status, because PTH can actually pull calcium from the bones. And the vitamin D, vitamin K2, calcium, magnesium can help to deposit that calcium back into the bones instead of having a deposit into the vasculature. So we want to see the full complement of things, not just vitamin D by itself. All right, so now we're going to get to hemoglobin A1C, which ideally, again, like we should have looked at A1C earlier in the video when we saw fasting blood glucose and fasting insulin, but it's kind of hodgepodge. So let's jump in and we'll see where Mark's A1C is at. This is part of the interesting point with this sugar diet.
But yeah, the hemoglobin A1C is at 5.4%. That's great.
Could be better though, right? Could be down to around 5.0, 5.1.
I don't worry about it.
Nitpicky. Okay.
Yeah, honestly, I don't, because there's actually a better marker called 1,5-AG. So A1C is going to give you like 90-day average, 60, 90-day average. 1,5-AG is more 2-week average.
Okay, so a hemoglobin A1C of 5.4%, I think that's actually ideal. I shoot for 5.4% or less with clients and for myself as well. At a minimum, I'd like to see somebody less than 5.6%, which is that cutoff for prediabetes, and then work to getting it to less than 5.4 and below. Now, this can be achieved even with high carbohydrate intake. My own A1C is less than 5.4% after 10 years on between 300 to 500 grams of sugar per day. And Mark had 6 months of high sugar intake and still had his A1C at 5.4%. So altering the diet, shifting body composition, dialing in hormonal health, micronutrient status, and inflammatory levels can actually help you or allow you to eat carbohydrates without having this bump up in the hemoglobin A1C, because you are insulin sensitive, because your cells and your tissues are uptaking that carbohydrate and utilizing it effectively. It's when you get metabolic dysfunction that it backs up into the bloodstream and you start to see an increased amount of glycation on the hemoglobin, which bumps up the A1C values. Now, Mike mentions 1,5-anhydroglutatol or 1,5-AG as a better marker. I personally don't use this one quite as much. I would rather just see somebody use a CGM. Now, what 1,5-AG tells us is basically when blood glucose spikes over 180 milligrams per deciliter, you wind up peeing out your 1,5-AG, and then your serum levels drop. So the lower your 1,5-AG level in your blood, basically the higher your post-meal blood sugar spikes are. So if you're spiking over 180 milligrams per deciliter consistently, you'll see a low 1,5-AG value. The thing is when you use a CGM, which you can get them like readily available now. There's Astello and there's Lingo. Those are ones from Dexcom, and the other ones I think from Abbott. And you can buy them online. You don't need a script or anything like this. When you use the CGM, and I do this with clients, you can actually see which meals have a high blood glucose spike across the day, and you can actually make adjustments to those meals so that you can optimize what's going on with the blood glucose, so you can keep those spikes less than 140 milligrams per deciliter. So that's what I'm typically shooting for on a consistent basis with clients. So it's more helpful, I think, to see the CGM because you can actually make targeted adjustments, especially if you have a CGM tracing and you also have chronometer right there, than just getting the 1,5-AG value by itself. And then what you would do is you could follow up and test the 1,5-AG, or you can just follow up 2 to 3 months later and see where the hemoglobin A1C value is after you set things up with the CGM. So I think the CGM is more helpful overall to look at. It gives you a lot more data. You have a 2-week window to look at this stuff. So I would use that over the 1,5-AG and then just follow up and make sure the A1C comes back into normal range. And this, again, you're making targeted dietary supplementary adjustments and making sure that you can see where your blood glucose is peaking after each meal. And also some people who run higher hemoglobin A1Cs, it's not because they're post-meal spikes. It's because they're bumping up overnight. And you won't see that necessarily with a 1,5-AG, but you can see that on a CGM, which is extremely helpful. All right, so now we're going to get into some of the hormonal stuff, which is quite interesting. It's also not fully in order here, but we'll still go through these components and talk about it. So let's get into the next clip.
So what's interesting is, Mark, you might notice, I'll share with you guys, your testosterone levels are amazing, free and total, fantastic, but your DHEA is low. And this is an important hormone for the brain and immune system. So we want to prioritize DHEA.
So obviously Mark's testosterone here looks great because he's on testosterone replacement. So I'm not surprised he's at 1,000. I like to see people at least greater than 700 nanograms per deciliter. I like to see free testosterone greater than 150 picograms per milliliter. Now, different labs will come back with different ranges with free testosterone. So you're trying to be at least in the upper quartile if possible on the free testosterone value for whatever range that you're looking at. Now, I would also want to see Mark's estradiol here so that we can see a ratio between his total testosterone and his estradiol. I generally like to see a 20 to 1 ratio. So this is something that we would want to see. Typically, you want to get a total testosterone, free testosterone, estradiol, SHBG, prolactin, LH, and FSH. So if things come back wonky, you can actually start to adjust and see where is the problem. If you just look at testosterone and it's low, you know it's low, but you don't know why. So, or you get testosterone-free testosterone and your total's fine, but your free is low and you don't know why now. Is it SHBG is bumped? So you really want to get all of these values together so you can understand why things are low and also look at metabolic function, micronutrient status, etc. So you actually have targeted solutions to adjust things. So the answer isn't just replacement, right? Because ideally you want to get to a state where your body can actually produce adequate amounts of testosterone. Now, in terms of DHEA or DHEA-S specifically, so make sure you test DHEA-S. We'll talk about that in a second. I generally like to see greater than 300 micrograms per deciliter. I also like to see cortisol with DHEA-S. Why? So what you can do is you can do a DHEA-S to cortisol ratio. And this is actually an indicator of chronic stress and overall adrenal function. And we really would want to see a ratio that's greater than 10 to 1. And quite a few people I've worked with that were running low carbohydrate diets, low calorie diets, fasting, or had chronic stress, they started to have their DHEA-S to cortisol ratio less than that 10 to 1, which is really not ideal. And that's something you definitely want to fix. The reason why is DHEA-S, or DHEA in general, is cortisol's counterbalance. So while cortisol is immunosuppressive, DHEA is immunostimulatory. While cortisol is catabolic, DHEA is anabolic. While cortisol worsens metabolic function, DHEA tends to improve metabolic function. So you want to have an optimal ratio there. And, it peaks in your between 20 to 30, around 25 is where you have that best ratio. And it's often called the youth-associated hormones. It's something that Dr. Pete talked about. So we really want an optimized DHEA-S to cortisol ratio. Now, the other thing here is when you're testing this, really important that you do DHEA-S, not just DHEA. DHEA-S is basically an indication of the storage amount of DHEA, the amount that you have floating around. The DHEA, that's not S, so DHEA stands for DHEA sulfate. That's your storage form. The regular DHEA, that will fluctuate based on different circumstances, whereas the DHEA-S gives you more of a long-term understanding of your total DHEA pool so that you can compare that to your cortisol. You don't just want to do DHEA. You can look at DHEA, but that's going to give you more of an indicator of acute stress based on the levels. In terms of improving DHEA-S, Mark mentions here he's going to increase the fat in his diet and, because some of his hormones are low. That may help. That is possible. You're going to replete some micronutrients if there's a problem there. But sometimes DHEA-S is a little bit resistant to coming back up after it's been depleted over time. So supplementing can be quite helpful. The biggest problem here, though, is that DHEA can convert to estradiol, can aromatize. So you want to do it in small incremental doses and then follow up on your lab values to make sure that you're not aromatizing it into estrogens as you take it. So I usually do like 5 milligram doses and then titrate up from there, spread them out over the day. You want to take them with meals because it's fat soluble. So this would be a way that you would improve that ratio. And also when you're testing DHEA-S, you really want to see cortisol. It's not as helpful to see it by itself. All right. So speaking of SHBG, we're actually going to see Mark's SHBG. And this is interesting because it can tie in with some of the low carb stuff.
What's nice is your sex hormone binding globulin is quite low. And that speaks to the fact that you have pretty high free testosterone. So whatever you're doing there is awesome. Mm-hmm. Or it could just be a natural thing for you.
I think it's always a little lower, yeah.
How it is, which is good. Some men, this is like sky high. It's weird. Everyone's a little bit different.
Okay, so I do think Mark's SHBG is decent, although I like to see the SHBG more between 35 to 45 nanomoles per liter. Now, I think Mark's SHBG is probably on the lower side because he's on testosterone replacement. He's on exogenous androgens, which can help to lower SHBG. When Mike is talking about some guys having high SHBG and we just don't know why, that can be the case. But a lot of times low carb dieting, low calorie dieting, fasting, and then excessive amounts of exercise can actually be driving SHBG up. So I worked with quite a few guys who actually had sky high SHBG, and it was just because they were doing these things. They were on a carnivore diet, they were on keto diets, low carbohydrate diets, or their exercise volume was high. And basically just bringing carbs on board or modulating those things can actually help to improve SHBG values. Also, estrogens tend to bump up SHBG. So if you are aromatizing heavily, that can increase the SHBG levels. Now, on the flip side, you don't want SHBG too low. This often goes hand in hand with metabolic dysfunction. The higher levels of insulin can actually suppress SHBG production at the liver. So we don't want a bottomed out SHBG level, but we also don't want a massively high SHBG level. Both are indicative of issues and both cause problems. When you have it really high, one of the biggest problems is that you don't get free testosterone. And the theory goes that you don't have the free hormone. It's not able to hit the target tissues because it's bound up to the proteins. So when you're looking for free testosterone, if you're looking at your SHBG and your albumin, because that's what's going to bind up these hormones. So again, we're looking for a Goldilocks zone range. We're not looking to be too high or too low. Both are associated with different problems. And then based on where they're at, you want to troubleshoot them. Mark's isn't too far off the mark. And I wouldn't be surprised with the exogenous hormone supplementation, as well as the higher carbohydrate intake, that is SHBG is on the lower side here. All right, next we're going to get into iron balance. It would have been ideal for this to be a little bit higher up when we were talking about blood viscosity and hematocrit and blood donations, but we'll get to it here anyway. It's a little bit out of order.
Now your ferritin is in the midline of the lab range, which this is your stored iron. So donating blood would not be problematic for you. Okay. You wouldn't have to worry about becoming anemic.
Okay, so Mark's ferritin here at 283 nanograms per milliliter, I actually think is on the higher end overall. This is probably a remnant from previous keto, carnivore, low carb eating that included high amounts of red meat. I personally like to see ferritin values between 50 to 100 nanograms per milliliter. The reason why is iron creates oxidative stress. So if you have too much iron on board, you have an increased risk of oxidative stress. And for somebody who has known cardiovascular risk factors, a positive CAC score, things like this, getting iron into an optimal range can be one of the strategies to actually minimize oxidative stress and improve overall longevity and health. So getting iron or ferritin here between 50 to 100 nanograms per milliliter through donation is something that I would personally consider. Also, something that I've seen with clients quite a bit is who've come out of the lower carb diets, or particularly carnivore. I've seen their iron stores be pretty high. Now, some people, they've been massively high because they had unknown heterozygous mutations or homozygous mutations for hemochromatosis, aka iron overload, or they had some alcohol consumption while they were doing carnivore, or they were just eating tons of iron in general. Improving that and getting those values down can make a huge difference, because the high amount of iron can put pressure on the liver and pressure on some of the organs, especially if it gets to really high levels, and it can drive blood glucose dysregulation by itself. So optimizing iron can be really important. I don't think Mark's levels are at that point here, but because he has a known cardiovascular risk, this would be one of the strategies I would look at to lower overall oxidative stress. Now, before you just go dump iron and start donating blood and stuff like this, it's important to actually look at a full iron panel, which would include serum iron, your iron saturation, and also total iron binding capacity, as well as ferritin, a high sensitivity CRP, complete blood count, and also looking at serum copper and ceruloplasmin, because copper is involved with iron metabolism, so that you can understand, do I actually have iron overload, or do I have an issue with iron metabolism in general? So you want to look at the full complement of things to understand how things are being metabolized and understand, do I need to donate now or not? So these are things that I would look at before just randomly doing a bunch of donations. I've also had clients who came from like root cause protocol or stuff like this, where they have gotten their iron levels too low. And again, like with all these values, if they are too low or too high, they're not in this optimal Goldilocks zone, you create problems, because iron is absolutely essential for a variety of proteins in your body involved in carrying oxygen, like in hemoglobin or in heme in general, as well as inside the mitochondria and some of the mitochondrial complex proteins that are involved with energy production. So we want to make sure we have optimal iron, but we don't want to have too much iron. So this is quite important. All right, so next we're going to actually look at some of the thyroid function markers. Again, these are out of order here, but let's jump in here and take a look.
Yeah, this is curious to go back and look at your historical thyroid peroxidase antibody levels, see if they've increased or decreased, or if you just hover around 17. Anytime someone has an antibody to a tissue, this is friendly fire. Your immune system is reacting to your thyroid for some reason. Just see if this changes over time.
Okay, so Mike makes a really good point here of trending your lab values so that you actually see where things are moving. I think this is really important. So as an example, this 17 international units per liter of the thyroid peroxidase antibodies, whatever, I don't think this is a big deal. But if the previous TPO antibody level was 1 and now it's 17, well, that's something to follow. If your previous ALT and AST values were 200 and now they're 60, well, that's a good thing, because they're actually coming down. They're on the downtrend. So you want to actually trend things, because some things, like if Mark's previous CRP was 6 and now he's 1.37, well, that's actually a massive improvement, and that's super helpful to see. So I wouldn't be as concerned about the CRP in that circumstance. I would say keep doing what you're doing, and we'll follow up on the next one. We'll make sure it's less than 1, and don't even bring any supplements or anything on board, because it seems like it's dropping by itself. So trending the things can be really important. It's a little weird here though, because like Mike kind of highlights this TPO antibody, but then we get to TSH, he's like, oh, this isn't really a big deal. Whereas the TSH on the higher side, so we'll see that. But I don't think that this TPO antibody here, if this is like a consistent value, 10, 17, something like this, is that big of a deal. It's in normal range. If it starts to trend up, then that would be something else to consider. So we'll jump into the next one here, and we'll look at the TSH and free T4, and then we're going to jump back and look at some other values.
Okay, so your TSH is up here. It was 3.3, slightly elevated, not alarming.
Right.
I wouldn't worry. I mean, now TSH is a pituitary hormone. It can increase because you need iodine. So oftentimes, because the thyroid stimulating hormone actually causes your cells to increase what's called the sodium iodide symporter or transport protein. So it can increase to get more iodine. So oftentimes when it's increased, we just give people more iodine.
Okay. So for me personally, I would like to see this TSH less than 2 micro IU per milliliter, or that would be ideal, especially because Mark has some of these cardiovascular risk factors, and thyroid is directly involved and associated with cardiovascular mortality and outcomes and plaque burden and stuff like this. So ideally, and there's papers showing this, when we look at this, you have association between serum TSH concentration, all-cause mortality, what we find is that a TSH around 2 or a little bit less is actually ideal for all-cause mortality. So we don't really want to see these higher values. You can see as you go to 4, 6, 8, that all-cause mortality starts to tick up. And if TSH gets super low, this is not on somebody who's necessarily on replacement hormone, on thyroid replacement, but if TSH gets super low, you can actually start to see the all-cause mortality tick up as well. So 2 is kind of this happy medium. The TSH in general does put a bit of pressure on the thyroid gland itself. So if it is on the higher end, we would want to bring that down, especially if we're seeing some degree of antibody production. So for me, I would like to see this less than 2. Also, I would be careful with just throwing iodine at a thyroid problem. So if the iodine dose gets too high, you can get something called the Wolff-Chaikoff effect, which is essentially when the iodine reaches a certain level, the thyroid gland decreases the uptake of iodine basically to protect itself. And then that leads to decrease in thyroid hormone output, which can worsen a hypothyroid state. So I personally wouldn't go over 1 milligram of iodine supplementation per day. And I would really try to get the iodine mainly from seafood, eggs, dairy, and then also seaweed, rather than direct iodine supplementation. I think that would be a better option overall, so you don't trigger this effect. Also, I don't know if seeing a TSH of 3.3 directly means, oh, this is an iodine problem. I would actually look at some of the other hormones. You could look at some of the stress hormones, and I would look at micronutrients. I'd look at copper. I'd look at zinc. I'd look at selenium. I'd look at iron and see in this also where this person's coming from in terms of their diet. Are they coming from low carb? Are they coming from low calorie dieting? I would look at these components and try to gauge if the TSH is bumped from that, rather than just throwing iodine at it. Iodine could be a component, but it also can be a dual-edged sword. Another example, I've had multiple examples of clients who have had suboptimal zinc, copper, and iron statuses. And then when we repleted those micronutrients, there's no thyroid supplementation, their TSH lowered, their free T3 improved, their free T4 improved, the reverse T3 levels dropped, and also their body temps increased. So sometimes correcting some of these more foundational components can give the body the appropriate micronutrients they need so that they can make the appropriate hormones and the enzymes are working effectively. Also, I've seen people who've been on low carbohydrate diets improve their overall thyroid panel just by adding in carbohydrates, seeing T3 increase, reverse T3 come down. And with that, we'll also look at a clip here where Mark and Mike talk about Mark's reverse T3.
Reverse T3, a little bit higher than we like to see. You could benefit from thyroid glandular supplements, but it's not alarmingly high. But
okay, so I agree here with Mike that the reverse T3 is a bit on the higher end. I generally like to see it less than 16 nanograms per deciliter. So 16.5 isn't too bad, although I'm not so sure that I would go straight to thyroid glandular. Like that wouldn't be my first option here. I would look to address dietary setup, training volume, stress levels before going straight to a thyroid glandular. So here's the thing. Mark's trying to get to really low body fat percentages. Yes, he's on a high carbohydrate diet, but he is essentially running a deficit. This can start to pick reverse T3 values up a bit. I would just try to get out of that deficit first if you're concerned about this reverse T3, because the levels will probably adjust. If you are on a low carbohydrate diet, that can bump up reverse T3 as well. If you have infections, that can bump up reverse T3 through cytokine signaling. So basically, fixing those things will fix reverse T3 instead of just throwing thyroid supplementation at it. Also, another thing that's important to keep in mind here is that if reverse T3 is trending upward and you throw a product that contains T4 thyroid hormone, like a thyroid glandular, right? Or just like levothyroxine, which is just pure T4 monotherapy, that can actually be problematic because that T4 can either be converted into T3 or reverse T3. And what basically will happen in this circumstance is that you can actually further increase reverse T3 because the system is shifted towards converting T4 to reverse T3, and you can make things worse. So in this circumstance, I would try to address the underlying fundamental problem so that you can actually decrease the conversion of your T4 to reverse T3 and get it to shift more towards T3 than just throw thyroid at this issue. And just throwing T4 or glandular that contains T4 could potentially be problematic by further bumping up reverse T3, which would be a net negative for thyroid signaling in general. So that would be my take here in terms of reverse T3. What we're going to go to next, these are our last two. So we have Mark's lipoprotein little a. So we'll talk about this.
Your LP little a, lipoprotein little a at 45. This is largely genetically, but also dietary determined. It'd be interesting to see when you increase the fat, how LP little a changes. So that's that.
Okay. So I personally like to see LP little a less than 20 nanomoles per liter. However, the fact that it's less than 75 nanomoles per liter is still pretty good overall. As Mike points out correctly, LP little a is largely genetic. The major problem with LP little a, the reason it's more atherogenic or considered more atherogenic, is because it's basically an LDL particle with an apolipoprotein A attached. Now, apolipoprotein A structure is quite similar to plasminogen, and plasminogen is basically one of the protein that's involved in fibrinolysis or breaking up with clots. And so there's a consideration LP little a basically competitively competes with plasminogen. And then basically it allows for an increase or drive in clotting and thrombogenesis, which can further worsen or drive atherogenesis or plaque formation. Now, LP little a, even though it is genetically determined, can actually be decreased with niacin. The problem with niacin, though, is that niacin, especially extended release niacin, is not really a good option because it can be pretty toxic for the liver. So if you're going to use niacin, you're probably going to want to combine it with something like a betaine, a B complex vitamin, and NAC, so that you can protect the liver from some of the toxicity of the niacin. And you definitely wouldn't want to use an extended or sustained release option. And you probably don't want to go over, I personally wouldn't even go over 1 gram, but 3 grams per day is the cutoff. Also, aspirin can be helpful to protect from some of the effects of LP little a, even if it doesn't massively drop it. And then interestingly here, Mark's testosterone therapy can also be helping to keep his LP little a on the lower end. However, that testosterone therapy can also lower his HDL levels, as we talked about before. So LP little a, this is a genetic risk factor. I'm actually going to make a video on it because there's some really interesting stuff from Linus Pauling's work. So I do want to talk about that with LP little a. But it is genetic. The major way to lower it would be niacin. It is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And then here we're going to get to our last clip. We're going to talk about kidney function, creatinine, muscle mass, and then we'll wrap up the video there.
That's your lean muscle mass. So the creatinine, a lot of people think that that's related to creatine consumption. It's not. It's a reflection of ammonia or nitrogen breakdown in the body. So the protein that you eat and the amount of lean muscle mass you had. Remember when I said, I was like, hey, you're probably 1.2. Like you're 1.25.
Okay. So Mike is correct here in the sense that higher muscle mass and protein intake, also with increased resistance training, can lead to increased creatinine in the blood. It's not necessarily or directly related to ammonia and the urea cycle. It is related to the phosphocreatine system inside the muscle tissue, and taking creatine can adjust these values. So that's important to keep in mind. The thing is your GFR value, which they talk about here, the GFR is a marker of kidney function, and GFR is calculated based on this creatinine value. So if you have a higher muscle mass, higher training load, higher protein intake, and you're supplementing creatine, you can see a bump up in your creatinine level. And that elevated creatinine level can actually lead to an artificially lower GFR value. It makes it look like your kidney function is lower when it's not necessarily lower. So in this circumstance, if I have a client who's a bodybuilder or who trains in general or is taking creatine, and I'm concerned about kidney function, I tend to actually look at a cystatin C with GFR, which is less likely to be affected by some of these values. And I personally like to see the GFR greater than 90 milliliters per minute. Overall. So this is something to consider when you're looking at kidney labs. It's some question I get actually quite a bit because a lot of people are supplementing creatine now. They're like, oh, what about my GFR? And I wanted to mention this piece here because it can be from the supplementation, the training, the increased protein intake, increased muscle mass, things like this will change that. So then look at cystatin C with GFR instead. I think that'd be a much better value. All right. So with all of this said, I think we can conclude that Mark's 6-month sugar diet didn't necessarily lead to insulin resistance. And I can already hear the skeptics in the comment section. They're saying, Mark's only been doing this for a few months. It's only a matter of time, Mike. It's only a matter of time. And in that case, my recommendation would be to check out the video where I showed my personal blood work after eating a high sugar diet for close to 10 years. So you can see what it looks like after 10 years. Now, I haven't been pounding granulated sugar and maple syrup and honey, but I have been doing high sugar from fruits. So I recommend you check that out. And I'll put the link here.